Warm welcome to all of you. It's really nice in some ways to, I mean, it would obviously be nicer to be all in the same room, but it's nice in this format to be able to welcome people who are both physically in London, but also in other parts of the world. So thank you all for joining us, and a particularly warm welcome to our new students on either the Masters in Global Affairs or other programs in the Global Institutes, and our new PhD students. I hope you're all finding your feet. You'll realise that your academic colleagues are still finding their feet as well at the moment. So a warm welcome to everyone. It's brilliant to have Professor Sanjay Srivastava speaking for us today. I, for one, am very much looking forward to his talk and being extracted from the day-to-day realities of the start of the new academic year. Sanjay, for those of you who don't know him, is currently the British Academy Global Professor at UCL and a Professor of Sociology at the Institute of Economic Growth in Delhi. He's an anthropologist by training whose research focuses on cultures of modernity in India. His current research focuses on new urbanism, urban cultures, and the changing relationships between the state, private capital, and that elusive category, the people, that is invoked so commonly today. He will be talking today about the Shaheen Bagh protests and street festivals in DLF City in Gurgaon, urban politics and the making of a new ordinary citizen. Just a quick note on Zoom etiquette before we get started. I think all of you currently do have your microphones muted, so please, if you could keep them muted while Sanjay speaks, and if you could use the chat function on Zoom to post questions as Sanjay is talking, and then we'll have a time for questions and answers at the end of the talk, but we will try not to interrupt Sanjay while he's talking. Without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Sanjay.
Okay, thank you.
And Vignesh as your slide mover.
Great, thanks a lot. Thank you, and thanks to the King's India Institute, and all of you who've organized this. What I want to do in this paper is to think about the remaking of ideas of the ordinary citizen, or notions of ordinariness. As you know, the term ordinary is used, as was mentioned, quite significantly around the world, and in India also. And I want to explore the relationship between the current political scenario in India, changing relationships between the state and private capital. And I want to focus on two localities in order to provide the background to my talk. One is Shaheen Bagh, and the protest that I'm sure all of you are familiar with. The other is DLF City in Gurgaon, which I'm sure many of you are also familiar with, and at two specific events in order to explore this idea of the ordinary person. So my talk explores the ways in which activities by middle and upper middle class residents of DLF City produce new narratives of ordinariness. And I'll explain what I mean by new narratives by juxtaposing it to the older narratives of ordinariness. Within these narratives, socio-economically privileged groups, I argue, come to be represented as the common people. So I'm trying to suggest to you that the social science literature and ordinariness, which is one kind of literature about the resistance of the ordinary against the elite, also requires to be rethought in the Indian context, or in many other contexts, where the ordinary has become part of an elite discourse of new forms of citizenship. Okay, so let me begin. I'll read it so I can finish in half an hour, 35 minutes or so. Now, the South Delhi locality of Shaheen Bagh, could I just have the first slide, which gives you an indication of the area that I'm talking about? DLF City. The round blue is where DLF City has a blue arrow, which indicates where Shaheen Bagh is. I'm sure most of you know, but just to give you some sense of the geography of the National Capital Region. So the first slide, which is a map. Thanks. Okay. The South Delhi locality of Shaheen Bagh is fairly typical of a very large number of settlements in the city that have the feel of informality about them. A maze of lanes overhung with electricity wires and television cables that snake around the neighborhood. A Unani doctor's clinic offering treatment by blood-sucking leeches, streets choked with irregularly parked vehicles and overlaid with a cacophony of blaring horns. A variety of coaching institutes for the competitive examinations for jobs and university admissions, food stalls, buildings, and impossibly narrow facades and multiple stories. and a large open drain that runs incongruously alongside the ultra-modern metro rail system. However, between December 15, 2019 and March 24, 2020, this visibly informal space became the site of a protest movement that sought to preserve the sanctity of that most formal of the documents of national life, the Indian Constitution. Now, Shaheen Bagh is a Muslim majority area, and it used to be open fields that was owned by one family that was sold off in bits and pieces. And the most immediate provocation for the protests was, of course, as you know, the Citizenship Amendment Act, CAA, that became law after being passed by the legislature on 12th of December 2019. The act was an amendment of the Citizenship Act of the Citizenship Act of 1955 and paved the way for the rapid granting of Indian citizenship to illegal immigrants who fled Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan on the grounds of religious persecution. However, while the CAA identified Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Parsis, Jains, and Christians as potential beneficiaries, there was no mention of Muslims from these countries. The act was widely seen as an anti-Muslim measure of the Bharatiya Janata Party. Along with the National Register of Citizens, the NRC, that requires stringent proof to establish citizenship, CAA was widely perceived to further strengthen the anti-Muslim narrative that had been so strongly a part of electoral strategies in recent times. A representative view of the protests at Shaheen Bagh is captured in the description by the online news portal The Wire, which noted that the locality had become, and I quote, the symbolic heart of the pro-constitution protests sweeping the country. Quite significantly, the protests were largely led by women, by Muslim women. Can I have the next slide, please? I'm sorry. Sorry, just if you go further down, there's a one with the women protesters. Go further, not the next one, not the next one after this. Yeah, let's stop there. Thank you. Now, the protesters at Shaheen Bagh were engaging with debates on citizenship and constitutional rights was also an important visual metaphor at the site. Artworks based on excerpts from the Constitution and its cover and images of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, among others, adorned the protest venue and became as much a talking point in the media as the protest itself. Yeah, thanks. Shaheen Bagh proved to be a catalyst of sorts, with similar protests being held in other Indian cities, including Mumbai and Lucknow. The popular sentiment that something has changed since the formation of the two BJP-led governments in 2014 and 2019 has taken strong root. However, just as palpably, there is a perception that ordinary citizens, such as those at Shaheen Bagh, have begun to raise their voice against the dilution of constitutional ideals that putatively guide the conduct of governance and relationships between the state and its citizens. Constitutional values and their defense by ordinary citizens are at the heart of a hopeful liberal discourse regarding the future life of the Republic. I suggest in my talk here that there is a broader process of the redefinition of the idea of the ordinariness that has emerged from the economic and social ferment of the last 3 decades. That is to say that there is one notion of ordinariness that has a longer history, Nehruvian history, but there's a redefinition of this notion that's been happening over the last 2-3 decades. And I want to explore this through urban processes. The liberalization of the economy since the late 1990s has generated new ideas about forms of citizenship, changing relationships between the state and private capital, and relations between the state and different categories of citizens, that is different class fractions and different religious fractions of citizens. These contexts, I want to further suggest, are significant in any discussion of the shift of the political and public mood towards the political and religious right in India. In particular, I want to suggest to you that while liberal opinion is expressed through the idea of ordinariness that derives from the discursive universe of a pre-liberalization economy and polity, there is another altered sense that provides a fruitful entry into the understanding the politics of the present, the politics that's happening right now. This changing sense of the ordinary stands in direct contrast to the imagined ordinariness of Shaheen Bagh, of the Shaheen Bagh protesters, and is in fact a challenge to it, supplanting it with the claims of another class, with the claims of another class and religious faction. My exploration of ordinariness is, however, different from invocations in social science literature that refer to either everyday life and ordinariness, such as, I'm referring here to works of Diserto, for example, or Jenny Robinson's work on ordinary cities, or the people, such as Laclau's notion of the people, as concepts that interrogate privileged models of social and political life. So my exploration is slightly different from this one. Specifically, I wish to point to instances where the term is deployed in both majoritarian and neoliberal politics to institute a representative of the people that, in fact, and this narrative, in fact, obfuscates its own language within networks of power and privilege. I explore these ideas through ethnographic vignettes based upon fieldwork in the privately constructed DLF City that lies in the district of Gurgaon, which is, of course, as you know, recently been renamed as Gurugram in the state of Haryana, which of course lies on the southern borders of Delhi. It began to be constructed from the early 1980s onwards, when DLF, the Delhi Land and Finance Company, acquires the license to start building a township there. The 3,500-acre DLF City adjoins the southern borders of Delhi and is a significant site for the remaking of ideas of ordinary citizenship, the ordinary citizenship that I am talking to you about. This, as I explained below, relates to the activism of its middle-class residents as they seek to engage with forms of state governance and practices of private capital. So this next section is called Remaking Cities and the Duties of the Citizen. DLF City was built by the Delhi Land and Finance Corporation, DLF, India's largest real estate company. The company began to acquire land in the early 1980s in what was early the rural hinterland of Haryana in the district of Gurgaon. DLF City, with its gated communities, shopping malls, and offices of many multinational companies, is regarded in a variety of writing as a crucible of consumer cultures and new identity politics of middle classness, both in popular literature and academic literature. As a new space of habitation that displays stark distinctions between the rich and the poor, DLF City is a site of considerable debate regarding the future of social and political life in a rapidly urbanizing country such as India. Again, this debate is both popular in media and academic literature as well. In addition to academic and media analysis, the Millennium City, as Gurgaon is frequently referred to in media reports and in various DLF advertising brochures. In addition to academic and media analyses, the Millennium City has also witnessed a number of residence initiatives that engage with ideas of how different types of residents, those within gated communities and the migrant labor working as domestic help and private security guards, for example, how the two groups might relate to each other as citizens. So in a recent book, as Veena Talwar Oldenburg points out, she says a new burgeoning middle class of young professionals, retirees fleeing the congestion of Delhi for more spacious accommodation, Indians returning from abroad and looking for creature comforts to which they're accustomed, have flocked to Gurgaon. And she says public vigils, protests, and activism of all sorts have enlivened a formerly moribund space and given it a profile of a bustling city. End of quote. Now, the idea of civic engagement in New Gurgaon has primarily manifested through discourses on the responsibilities of the relatively privileged towards socioeconomically disadvantaged populations. And as part of this, one of the most interesting aspects of urban life in Gurgaon relates to the ways in which the street has become a symbol of middle-class identity. The manner in which the street has become the symbol of middle-class identity. From being a space that is historically marked by chaos and the lower classes, it has increasingly become one where multiple dramas of middle-classness are played out in a place such as Gurgaon. The streets of DLF City are increasingly home to bicycling, walking, and fitness activities that are part of a new politics of leisure. And I can't go into this politics, but I can have a discussion later on, if you like. A new politics of leisure that is intrinsic to performances of middle-class identity. As Asa Doran and Ira Raja point out in a separate article, they say that in India, the filth endured in public spaces has to do with the neglect of spaces that people share with those beneath them, in the case, in the caste hierarchy. But that, as they carry on, the tolerance of filth in public spaces declines with the rise of the new middle class, which is no longer as inclined to retire to the interior spaces of the home as it is intent on claiming public spaces for its private consumption. Now, while, as I said, while space doesn't permit me and time doesn't permit me to fully elaborate on the complex manner in which the street relates to middle-class identity, I will utilize ethnographic accounts from an event known as Rahagiri, streetness, and perhaps some of you have heard of it, to provide some indication of the link between the changing nature of ordinariness and the broader political context. So I'll begin with this account of something that's something that takes place, well, used to take place with the COVID lockdown, an event known as Rahagiri in Gurgaon. Let me explain what it is in order to flesh out the argument that I'm making. Rahagiri, streetness, streetism, is based on similar so-called open street events that are held around the world and whose origins lie in the Ciclovia movement that began in the mid-1970s in the Colombian capital of Bogota. Ciclovia started as a so-called citizens protest that the city was becoming too car-focused. The Rahagiri in Gurgaon was first held in 2013 and was promoted as a citizens initiative and I quote, to take back the streets. The event started as a collaborative venture between two local NGOs, one involved in environmental issues, and the other working with the poor. A bicycle riding group, a private company that provides corporate wellness programs, and a global consultancy company that focuses on sustainable cities. This group works in consultation with the Gurgaon city administration that does the policing arrangements and blocking of streets, etc. And the DLF Corporation, because the Rahagiri events take place primarily in DLF's area, DLF City 1, Phase 1, Phase 2, etc., etc. The following description is drawn from my ongoing fieldwork in the locality. It's a cold Sunday morning in Gurgaon. On several stretches of the roads that run through DLF City, Phase 4, along which lie some of DLF's most earliest and most prestigious gated communities. Along some of the streets in Phase 4, there are red plastic witches' cones, cone barriers in place. The roads have been blocked off to vehicular traffic. There are families with children, dogs, children on bicycles, elderly couples, grandparents pushing prams, and women in exercise clothing. The area near the popular Galleria Market shopping complex is buzzing with activity. First off, there's a Nike-sponsored, can I just have the next slide, please? First off, there's a Nike-sponsored yoga class with mats for each participant. The female instructor sits in front on a stage. Behind her is a board that advertises Nike's yoga gear. Next, there is another Nike-sponsored area where people of different ages and genders are exercising to music. There are instructors on stage in colorful clothing. Behind this, there's an area sponsored by the Hindustan Times newspaper, where free jackets are being given away. The jackets are inscribed with the logo of the newspaper, Hindustan Times newspaper, as well as one that says, "I love Gurgaon." This giveaway is part of a competition. An excitable compare is geeing up the crowd. Anyone wearing Adidas shoes, or Lotto shoes, or Nike shoes, Benetton clothing, he calls out on the microphone. Each time, one such wearer is invited onto the stage. After gathering 5 people, the game begins. It's a version of Simon Says, and the contestants must carry out a particular action where the compare calls out Hindustan and Times. All contestants introduce themselves. There's a man who works as an advisor with KPMG consulting firm, and there's another one who works with a similar Indian company. Can I have the next slide? Okay, just leave it there. Further along, there's a mini soccer ground sponsored by a local soccer coaching business. It displays the banner of a European football club and has a tie-up with the company. Groups of children are also playing badminton. Along various footpaths, there are small billboards of various corporate sponsors. Among them, there are some that say Hindustan Times Rahagiri, others that say Times of India Rahagiri. Other groups have also joined the crowds, taking part in aerobics and yoga, soccer and badminton. There is one group marching around with Narendra Modi masks, shouting, "Long live Narendra Modi." There's another demonstrating against a real estate developer BPTP, which has been accused of not completing its projects according to schedule and hence causing financial and other hardship to various buyers. This is a performative space sponsored by corporate interests and one where middle and upper middle class families feel comfortable. The cordon of Stretch and its revelers in a variety of branded sportswear are the new signals of class and cosmopolitanism. physical exercise, bicycle groups, yoga classes, aerobics, Pilates, Zumba workouts, among others, are the accompaniment to new spaces of habitation and leisure, such as Gurgaon in DLF City, and the rhythms of new life and performances of new styles. Sports bicycles are being checked out. They're free to borrow, sponsored by a national newspaper, and their riders career through the crowds. Nike-sponsored aerobics classes has enthusiastic participation from young women in lycra suits, children and middle-aged men and women, all of whom step onto the mats placed in front of them, eagerly following instructions from the female instructor and her assistants on the stage, each with a remote microphone. Bodies move in erratic unison to the music from the stage, festooned with the Nike logo, including on the persons of the instructors. A short distance away, however, from the Pilates sections, a short distance away from the Pilates section, an NGO that calls itself We the People has set up what it calls a Citizens Cafe. It consists of a group of middle-class women and men talking about the Constitution. Participants have been given copies of the preamble of the Constitution. There's a discussion regarding individual responsibility, being a good citizen. Being a good citizen, someone says, is a 24/7 job. A man adds that we need to be compassionate towards our servants. We demand various facilities at our own workplace, such as holidays, sick leave, etc. We deny these to those who work in our houses. Another participant interjects that compassion, he says, has a peculiar smell, and he doesn't like that. The organizer, a woman, says that there are laws regarding domestic work that ought to be applied. There's a debate over this, and another woman says that she doesn't care where there's a smell or a fragrance. She thinks compassion is an appropriate word to use. A woman talks about everyday democracy, about how in her locality, middle-class children are encouraged with those, she says, who are of the labor class, or people who work as domestic labor. But there's also another set of bodies that are present at Ragi every morning. They're not part of the group, not the Nike group. These bodies instead line the footpaths along these streets of activity. They are clothed in an assortment of garments that smell of compulsion. Shiny trousers, worn mufflers, torn beanies, fraying saris, and cracked footwear is the fashion of the footpath. They look on at the performers on the streets. The men and the women stare, these men and women stare, and their children strain to break away from the hand grip of their guardians. Some have indeed managed to make good their escape and have joined the Nike-fueled crowd, but they remain some distance away from the main group at the back. They make erratic and frenetic movements, throwing up their hands and stretching limbs at will, dancing to the music, but also out of sync with it. This crowd that watches consists of domestic workers, rickshaw pullers, private security guards, and a variety of people who sell peanuts or make a living from other informal businesses. There's also a scattering of curious policemen and policewomen. Everyone is watching. In the bright winter sun, it makes for a great spectacle. Raigiri is one of several sites where ideas of ordinary citizenship and the people are being redefined in the post-liberalization period. It acts, as I suggest in my concluding section, as a counterpoint to the ordinariness that is staged at Shaheen Bagh, that was being staged at Shaheen Bagh. Historically, the Nehruvian state, with development as its raison d'etre, identified the poor farmer, the slum dweller, and members of socially and economically disadvantaged minority groups as the people. However, within a post-liberalization discourse, there's a new constitutional subject, that is a transformation of the older national citizen to a consumer citizen, a new constitutional subject that is imagined as the ordinary man, and I use the word man deliberately. Namely, the middle and upper middle class urban resident, the middle and upper middle class Hindu urban resident. Here, the street is one of several sites of manifesting an ordinariness that in other contexts has implied demands upon the state regarding the welfare of these putatively previously ignored class fraction. The appropriation of the street, cleansed of social and material filth through private sponsorship and state sponsorship, is part of a middle-class statement regarding the nature of the public that belongs, in public spaces. The emergence of the middle-class person, honest, hardworking, and putatively sidelined in the state's imagination of the nation, historically sidelined in the state's imagination of the nation and its ordinariness, that the emergence of this middle-class person as a representative public has, as I will suggest later, a specific role in the making of the present political movement. However, before I outline this, there's one more context of the transformation to be considered. This section is called Redefining Civil Society. The making of the ordinary citizen and a new public is also part of a process that is signified by new relationships between capital, private capital, and the state. In the example I discussed below, capital, in effect, in a place like Gurgaon, has produced its own citizens, its own civil society, such that the historical notion of the separate and autonomous spheres of the state, citizens, and private capital actually becomes quite untenable. What we are left with, in fact, as I'll explain, is the simulacrum of the autonomous spheres. Many services within the privately developed townships of Gurgaon, such as upkeep of roads and external active security, are provided by the developers who established these townships, rather than the Municipal Corporation of Gurgaon, which was established in 2008. The fees that residents pay to the developers are known as maintenance charges. These are paid to the real estate company that has constructed the locality. In the late 1980s, some residents of DLF City combined to form a Residents Welfare Association. I've called this RWO1. And they demanded that, as required by the Haryana Development and Regulation of Urban Areas Act of 1975, private companies should hand over the township to the government. Its members, RW1's members, filed court cases, petitioned the government, and even fought an assembly in municipal elections. An office holder of RW1 described the situation to me as follows. He said, developers don't really want to hand over the townships to the government, and the government is not interested either. But as long as the developer has control, it can use the land within its area in an arbitrary fashion. So by simply changing the original planning agreements, if in the original plan, a particular area was demarcated as a dispensary, as land values go up, you can, the developer decides to build a gated community. And this man went on to say, the government doesn't wish to change anything because of the massive amounts of under-the-table money that it gets from private developers. And the developers obviously don't want to change it because of the benefit they have. In the early 2000s, another RWA, let me call this RWA2, also appeared on the scene in Gurgaon, in DLF City. It was an umbrella body that claimed allegiance from nearly 200 other different individual RWAs. RWA2 was in fact created by DLF Corporation to counter what it perceived to be an association of residents that was hostile to its interests, that is RWA1. In particular, the demand that the company hand over the township to be administered by the Haryana government. RWA2, the RWA sponsored by the DLF Corporation, operates from an office in the same building as many of DLF's offices. The company had taken legal measures which resulted in RWA1, the older RWA, going into liquidation. RWA2, as one of its office holders told me, primarily acts, he said, as a bridge between the real estate company and residents of the locality built by it. I provide the above vignette by way of pointing out to the significant renegotiations in the relationship between the state, private capital, and the citizens that form a context within which a great deal of RWA activity, in fact, redefines the notion of civil society. So, contemporary discourses connected to RWA activity, such as those related to RWA2, DLF RWA, point us to a context where private capital, discomforted by actions in the public realm, is able to produce its own civil society, its own people. If you consider resident welfare associations and neighborhood groups as historically independent realms, that realms of citizenship that in effect contest what private capital might say and contest what the state might say. In this case, I want to suggest to you that private capital is able to create its own civil society. The changing relationship between the state and private capital is the broader context for a process where civil society and citizenship are no longer linked to the rights-bearing citizen. Rather, the ideas of the ordinary citizen and a functioning civil society in the shape of RWAs relate to the new cultures of corporatization of the state and state-like transformations of private capital in India. So I'm suggesting to you that here, the ordinary citizen here is in fact produced by private capital. And that's another way in which the notion of the ordinariness itself is transforming as the relationship between the state, private capital, and the new ordinary citizen is undergoing transformation. So let me conclude. This is called the political present. My discussion has suggested that a significant aspect of the contemporary moment in India is the process of the remaking of the idea of the ordinary person and ordinary publicness, and who belongs in this ordinary public space. And that in turn, this also constitutes a refashioning of the relationship between the state and the people, such that the former, the state, is increasingly imagined as a friend of the middle classes, as a friend of this ordinary citizen. Whereas if you remember, in the immediate post-colonial period, the raison d'etre of the developmental state was for the poor, not so much the middle classes. As the friend of now it's the friend of the middle classes. Even the vanquished RWA1, the earlier one, was in fact formed with the idea that the state will pay heed to a body representing middle class interests. This, I've suggested, is a change from the earlier period of post-colonial history. The making of ordinariness in a time of consumerist modernity has specific consequences. It unfolds through differentiating good consumers from bad ones, and in turn identifying the good ordinary citizen from his or her antithesis. So quite often you hear complaints about how good citizens consume electricity, pay for the electricity, where the slum dwellers steal it, where the good citizens are penalized because they're honest taxpayers. More specifically, in the context of this discussion, the ordinary citizen has become synonymous with the upper caste, middle class Hindu subject, foregrounding a historically privileged group at the cost of others. For over the past 3 decades or so, this is the most clearly identifiable beneficiary of the liberalization process, as well, and is the most vocal complainant against perceived minority appeasement, reservations, etc., which is of course the popular term for special provisions for socio-economically marginal groups by the state. Within this discourse of new ordinariness, it is suggested that political parties have favored certain groups, the poor, lower caste, and Muslims, for example, over the rightful claims of a class fraction that had contributed its might to the making of a new and globalized India. A transition from the Nehruvian state of liberalization to the liberalization of the economy also coincides with the shrinking public sector and fewer number of government jobs. This has further fueled resentment against so-called minority appeasements of various kinds. The consequence of the above is the augmented capacity, I want to suggest to you, of the BJP, for example, and the Hindu right to speak in the name of a new ordinary person who provides an alternative to the older one, the one who might be a Shaheen Bagh, the one who might want reservations, for example. Hence, the claims of the protesting women of Shaheen Bagh to marginality and commonness are subject, in light of the growing discourse of the new ordinary, to scrutiny and contestation. The production of multiple ordinariness is in effect an appropriation of the historical experience of suffering and discrimination by the privileged from the marginalized. In the present context, the alternative discourse of the new discourse of ordinariness is also grist for the mill for the religious right, and has been well utilized to undermine many of the constitutional rights and guarantees to the most vulnerable in Indian society, including religious minorities. This has been done in keeping with the narrative of the new ordinary, in the name of chastising a pampered minority who have putatively benefited at the cost of a silent common majority. Finally, as I've tried to show here through the example of RWA2, the DLF RWA, as the relationship between the state and private capital transforms, it gives birth to an idea of civil society that is linked from constitutional rights and responsibilities. Rather, it reflects the depoliticization of the state and its privatization through the emergence of a citizenship ideal based on the demands of private capital. This privatized model of citizenship contributes to a context where other versions, those that seek to reinstitute the public nature of the state through interrogating its stance on religious equality, for example, where these other versions come to be labeled as both anti-state and anti-national. For these other versions, question the naturalization of the new form of the state and nation and the new forms of the ordinary citizen. These are long-term processes, I suggest, that form the groundwork for the making of contemporary political movement in India and the making of an urban movement in India that is intrinsically linked to the engendering of specifically new ideas of the ordinary citizen and what he deserves, in contrast to the others who are increasingly characterized as people who have been given certain rights, certain access to resources, which they didn't deserve. And I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sanjay. I'm afraid I've just lost my own internet connection at the end of your talk there. So I've just come back online myself. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of that is that I've also lost the messages that questions you might have posed in the chat box. So in a minute, I'm going to ask Vignesh if he could tell me what's in the chat box. But I wanted to ask you, and you may have started to touch on this in your concluding remarks, Sanjay, but I mean, absolutely fascinating, this idea that private capital is reproducing a kind of new form of civil society. And the question that was kind of playing through my mind as you spoke is that there's also a story about what's happening to the relationship between private capital and the state as well. You foreground the kind of relationship between private capital and civil society. And I just wanted to push you a bit, I suppose, to reflect on what the kind of wider implications are for the way we might think about how state-capital relations are also being redefined in the present, and the extent to which the story that you're telling us about the role of developers in DLF City in seeking to shield themselves from state regulation or state governance of townships is also telling us a story about the fractures which might be appearing between the state and private capital, and whether in this there is also a wider story about a kind of a withdrawal from a kind of a public sphere of democracy which actually in some ways could serve to ultimately in the longer term trouble a kind of dominant narrative of Hindutva and majoritarian politics, because I'm not clear that this is a kind of a one-way street in which the redefinition of ordinariness necessarily underpins the form of politics we see today. It could also be the site in which that dominant political narrative might start to be fractured. Would you just respond to that, and I'll just see if I can retrieve other questions from the chat.
I mean, it's an important question, and one of the things, I mean, I actually didn't invoke the term neoliberalism, because that for me is a very easy way of, and not a very productive way actually, of trying to understand what capital does. And I think we need to have a much more specific regional understanding of what capital does. And that's an important point. I wouldn't argue that there is some kind of an iron cast iron law of history which says that, that necessarily the dominant narrative of Hindutva is going to triumph, irrespective of and supported by private capital. It could go either way. But having said that, I think it could go either way depending on what capital feels where its interests lie. I mean, and that's why I think we need to have much more specific understanding of capital and regional understanding capitals. In fact, you know, there's something called the 100 Smart Cities Mission, where the government of India has committed something like $15 billion to, and where it is private capital, which they draw up the maps for how smart cities should be, who should compete to become a smart city. They do the hand-holding exercise in municipal bodies. They advise the bodies how to raise money. There's something called a special purpose vehicle, which each smart cities to be administered by, and that's done by large companies, which is that's Google or Cisco Systems and various KPMG or Boston Consulting. In most of my work in this area, it really depends. It's contingent on what is happening within that particular city. So in Jalandhar, for example, which is in Punjab, a Congress-ruled state, capital will operate according to the politics of that state, which is not in favor of central politics. The smart cities is a central government policy. So I would certainly go along with it. I don't think there is one specific answer to saying that, or it may well be the dominant narrative may crack. But then the caveat would be that I'm more uncertain about that than saying that it will crack, simply because the contemporary narrative of the religious right is at one, I would argue, with I think vast numbers of people who live in places like Gurgaon. I wouldn't say all. So, and if capital pays attention to what its consumers want, the kinds of images they want. So, example, you know, it's very common now for most new gated communities in Gurgaon, in fact, all over India, to have a temple built within them as part of the urban development. So, capital listens to what consumers want. It could go either way, you're right. But I think at present, I would argue that what consumers want is a very specific kind of imagery, which is not for me a happy one. But again, I would agree that there's no, I wouldn't argue for some kind of a iron law of history which says that this is exactly what's going to happen. It could go either way. Yeah.
Thanks, Sanjay. I've got some questions stacking up here, and I'd like to invite people actually to pose them themselves. So if I could invite first Aditya Ramesh, and then Humaira Iqtidar and Claire Reynolds. I think that's Claire Reynolds. So Aditya, would you like to unmute yourself and put your question down?
Thanks, Sanjay, for a very interesting, very provocative talk. I guess I have a couple of questions. My first one is on the kind of environment. Your image was quite striking in the sense that, you know, it was a shaded street. The politics of air has become quite a major playing field for a lot of middle class understandings of what the good life constitutes. And I was wondering whether the new citizen also has something to do with not the street and not just kind of the political elements of the street, but also its ecology. That's my first one. The second one is when you argue that there's a kind of regional sense of capital that we need to understand, I'm wondering whether whether you're sort of overstating that Nehruvian ordinary citizen space of it kind of being that with that Partha Chatterjee, that conception of, you know, the street being a place of radical politics. And it seems like it was really 70s, 80s UP, there were movements, Tamil Nadu, there were movements. I think there's a kind of regional framework there of what constituted ordinary citizens, which it's not a fully formulated question, but I feel like, you know, there's so many company towns, etc., where similarly there was a kind of capital state coalition where the streets were fairly manicured, and so that's my kind of image. So it's just it's just a thought. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks. Are you okay, Sanjay, if we take a few questions?
Okay, all right, yeah, that's fine.
And Vignesh, would you mind turning the slides off so that we can see everyone in gallery view? Lovely. So I had next Humaira on my list.
Right, thank you, Louise, and thank you, Sanjay, for a really, really interesting talk as usual. So I had two quick questions. One actually follows quite well from the previous one. You know, one of the things that has also changed are the aspirations of the working class. And those transformations have also impacted how the middle class, in a sense, views itself. So to go back to the Nehruvian context in India, but also in Pakistan, which necessarily did not have the same level of discourse of equality. Nevertheless, there was a sense that, you know, there was greater social, there was a discourse of looking after the poor that has entirely disappeared now. But actually, that discourse of looking after the poor went hand in hand with perhaps fairly strict social limits to social mobility and fairly strict social distinctions, and an expectation that the aspirations of the poor will not outstrip the ability of the middle and upper middle classes to manage them. And what has happened now seems to be that the working classes are actually you know, demanding more in a sense. So even though the discourse is no longer of looking after the poor themselves are actually asking for much more from the middle classes. So how does that play out in the context that you're talking about? And the second question was really also about I guess the changes within capital and the changes to the form of capital, and you alluded to that a little bit, but I was struck, of course, with the parallel with Habermas's vision of the public sphere. And again, that is a public sphere in the European context that was built through and by capital in some ways, although Habermas thinks of it as being slightly separate from, or at least not being led by capital. But you're talking about a new public sphere that is very much shaped by capital. Is this local capital? Is this international capital? What is different about, how would you characterize this capital?
Sure.
Is it different from, say, the capital that, or capitalism that, or capitalists who existed in the Nehruvian era?
Do you mind if I answer these two? They're quite...
Yes, please do.
Okay. So let me just begin with Aditya's, they both are really, I mean, if in a longer version of this paper, because these are both questions that could constitute a book. Yeah. But let me just begin with the Aditya's question, second question first, which is the street. I mean, of course, the steel towns example is a really good example, because, that relationship was not between private capital and the state. That was between one state capital and another state, capital of two, whether Germany and India, with US and India, whether Russia and India, okay? And I think what has happened dramatically, and I think, and I'm not able to, I can't even elaborate here, but the kinds of relationships that produces in terms of what happens in the city would be very different from the relationship that are now produced between the street as that is produced by the relationship between private capital and the state. In fact, I've done a little bit of work on steel towns, and I think it's a really interesting. And so I would argue that there is a way of thinking of the street differently now, because the relationships are quite different. For example, just to be very brief on this, right now, when private capital creates these streets and street activities, it's mainly around ideas of choice, but choice of what? Not choice of what kind of democracy that you have, but the choice of what are the goods and commodities that you consume. How do you constitute your life around that? Which leads me to, and I'm not able to answer that question fully because of time, but I think there is a difference because of the different forms of capital that are now involved, not state capital and private capital. But the other question on ecology, I mean, there is a broader work to be done about the politics of leisure in many Indian cities, which have to do with ecology, which have to do with the quality of air one breathes. Gurgaon is a very strong hub of bicycling as leisure, in fact. There's a huge biodiversity park that's been created by a local NGO sponsored by Citibank, etc., etc. So there's a great deal of emphasis and efflorescence of the notion of the air that we breathe. And in fact, there are any number of NGOs which almost on a monthly basis have little conferences and workshops on the environment. The politics of that is really significant in as much as, of course, that ethereal air is fundamentally also linked to the material aspects of Gurgaon. And what does one do with a place like Gurgaon? What does one do with the kind of people who live there? What does one do with the kind of people who are apparently not aligned to these new politics of leisure, the new politics of the environment? So ecology is a really significant part of the identity of, and I'll make my claim more modest, the identity of the new ordinary person. And I think it's almost fundamental to how a new certain kind of ordinariness is being defined, the ecological aspect, which is linked, I think, quite deeply to, in fact, ideas of new ordinariness and what is different between this new ordinariness and an older ordinariness. I mean, I would still argue that, I mean, I'm not, while there is a danger of sort of kind of overemphasizing the Nehruvian period almost like a straw person, because it's so easy to do, I think there are very specific differences. I think there are quite strong differences. The manner in which the bureaucracy operated and what is happening with the bureaucracy right now, for example. And just go back to my first response to Louise, I mean, the bureaucracy right now that deals with smart city mission is largely a bureaucracy which must show itself to be cosmopolitan in a particular manner and hence try to understand technology, which it actually doesn't understand at all, which is quite different from the older bureaucracy, whose, for good or bad, whose allegiance or whose focus was on what it saw as nation building, right? For good or bad, whatever that term means. I think the current relationship between state and private capital has also produced increasingly a state and a bureaucracy that is committed to a global cosmopolitanism and being seen to be global, and hence producing new narratives of the nation, of the city, new ordinariness. Let me just, and I come back to some of these. Let me just go to Humaira's question. So, of course, the Pakistan example is quite interesting. If you read the history of, say, the Communist Party of Pakistan, Kamran's book, for example. And indeed, and you're absolutely right. A short while ago, I wrote a newspaper article about that the older liberalism, and I'd probably say this of Pakistan as well, certainly India, was a liberalism which was completely comfortable with itself because it was fully aware that its objects were never questioned. It was fully aware that they knew their limits. And the current problem is that its objects, whether in Pakistan, poor people in India, are questioning the nature of the older liberalism. So I would argue that in fact the older liberalism was able to be generous, to able to operate through a notion of noblesse oblige, because its authority, the limits that it set, as you mentioned, were never questioned. That you could offer certain form of noblesse oblige, knowing fully well that those you offered it to were never really going to come up to your standards or would be allowed. So I would argue, in fact, so that's why I'm skeptical of claims that say that, things have really changed dramatically. That there was older liberalism, the older notions of being hybrid and religious tolerance. I don't think things have changed very dramatically. I think only the state has changed dramatically. And if you have a different state, and I think in our part of the world, it's extraordinarily state-driven societies. If you have a different state, you get a different discourse. So I would argue, I would agree with that. I think what's happened is that under the new context, because different groups are demanding that the older liberal, or saying that older liberalism is not what it actually claimed to be, and they're demanding much more of it, I think that it's collapsed. And that's why you find lots of people who you thought people would say, oh, these were liberals. They're actually now saying things that they think they can say. Because in many ways, I think the older liberal was, for me, it was a very fragile and, to put it bluntly, slightly suspect. But what happens when capital and public sphere? Well, I would argue that, again, without meaning to present some kind of sort of a deterministic argument about what capital can do, I think it creates public spheres which can be determined by those who are the most direct consumers, direct beneficiaries, consumers of what capital produces, and that is the danger. So I mean, in some sense, sometimes think, well, capital just wants to make money. So if it's going to make money out of non-religious things, it will make money out of that, and that's where salvation lies. But I guess we have to look. I guess I would argue that what capital does is that it produces certain kinds of spaces. Again, in our part of the world, I wouldn't argue the state has been a terrific thing. So I would never say that we've had a pre-liberalization state that was a wonderful state and it did wonderful things. It didn't. So in fact, I sometimes in my middle age start sounding like a right-wing person when I almost begin to argue that perhaps capital can offer some hope. But I think capital, in creating these public spheres, will end up creating the public spheres where its direct beneficiaries are able to dictate the terms of those public spheres. And if those terms have to do with some form of conservatism, then that's what will happen. I mean, capital itself is an empty vessel. I mean, that's what I would say. That's what's happening in many such places in India. And I noticed that, of course, Pakistan also has a new history of building new urban townships. Capital creates its own nationalism.
Sanjay, I'm going to interrupt for a moment because you have a stack of questions building up here, and I'd like to give people a chance to ask you, because I think you've provoked a lot of thought. So I have Claire, Mukhalika, Shobi, and Kriti. So I think that probably are will be all we have time for. If I could ask you to put your questions reasonably concisely. Claire, would you like to go first? And maybe put your video on if you don't mind.
I can't actually. I need to restart my computer to get my video on.
Okay,
so sorry.
don't worry.
Yeah, thank you very much. I found that really interesting. I'm interested in this idea that you touched on at the end there of deserving, and kind of the link of the deserving citizen with the ordinary, and kind of where you locate that. So is it something that's being produced or asserted, and is that by the citizens themselves? Or, I mean, it relates to the last point actually, in that you were saying that a lot of political discourses, well, generally political discourses are state driven, and in fact, is it more that than coming from the citizens themselves, if that makes sense? Thank you.
Thanks. Mukalika.
Thank you, Sanjay, for provoking us. I heard your paper with giant quotation marks around it when you started, and they kind of disappeared by the end. So the question, very simply put, is, are you using words like ordinary, citizen, constitutional subject, private, in quotation marks? Or are you using these terms to define this new phenomenon without those disclaimers, in which case there's a danger of hollowing out the sort of philosophical civic content of these terms of citizenship, which clearly bodies like the RWA simply don't perform? Thank you.
Shodhi.
Yeah, hi. So my question kind of follows a little bit Mukalika's question. I wonder what is a good framework for really understanding the urban state in India right now? A few different reasons. For example, I know the smart cities framework to understand this new urban India, and what the state sees as urban India is used a lot, but smart cities is not really in action. I mean, it's kind of been in the works for a while, but there really isn't a lot of stuff done under smart cities. And I don't think it really represents the forces shaping urban India in terms of public space, or in terms of urban aspiration, or the structure of citizenry, I think, in urban India. So I don't think smart cities is very valid for that. On the other hand, if you take something like a Gurgaon, for example, which is this artificial built city where the demographic is primarily upper class incoming migrants, young migrants from all over India, the citizenry, or the urban citizenry, is very different from the middle class and upper class citizens in a place like Mumbai, where RWAs function in a very different way, or RWAs in a place like Bangalore, which has a very different kind of urban spirit, if I might put it. So I think, so for example, how do we go about creating an analytic framework for understanding who is laying claims to being an urban citizen in India right now? How do we understand the way urban citizens, urban middle and upper class citizens voting right wing, but then you also have a very strong working class, lower middle class, and slum-based citizenry that are laying very strong claims to the urban state as well. So how do we understand, or even understand what may happen, for example, over the next 4 to 5 years when the next election cycle comes about? Because I don't think looking at it primarily through the upper class or upper middle class is a good way to go about it. I think the transformations and the conflicts are much deeper than that.
Thanks, Shobhi. I'm going to ask Kriti as well finally now, and then we'll give you a right to reply. Sanjay.
Thank you, Sanjay, and thank you, Louise. I think I'm going to echo the anthropologist's questions here, which, I mean, most recently that's what was asked by Mukalika. My question is about actually the purchase of the ordinary in your analysis, and how, when I was thinking constantly of Veena Das's use of and actually work on the ordinary, descent into the ordinary, and on the one hand, and the kind of plethora of work we've been seeing now on the concept of banality. So so I was wondering, how would you sort of, why would you choose to use? Why have you chosen to use the word ordinary as opposed to the everyday or the banal, which all kind of without losing, as Mukalika rightly pointed out, their actual analytical purchase. Because I wasn't quite sure what exactly was ordinary here. It was, and how would you situate yourself vis-a-vis, say, Veena Das, who's actually written quite a bit on this.
Thanks, Kriti. So Sanjay, over to you.
Okay. These are, of course, really big questions.
I mean, answer what you can. If you know.
I mean, and sometimes they'll overlap. Just a quick response to how has this happened. The first question from Claire. I think part of it has to do with, but let me say why I use the term ordinary, because it's a term that is, it's almost like an Indian word. That's why it's used very commonly by people. I don't think they use it in the same sense that social science people may use it for the, in terms of political purchase. And I was using it, one in that quotation marks when I present to you, but also in the way that people use it in, and what they understand to be the ordinary person, which is a person who has been historically ignored. And I'm interested in tracking how this discourse has emerged. Of course, our most immediate example is from the Aam Aadmi Party. We are the ordinary people, which is organized around what are ordinary people most concerned about? Corruption. Okay, and that is, of course, very common. So on the one hand, I think it is using in quotation marks to, but on the other, trying to explore what that non-quotation mark ordinariness, which I'm not saying that these are ordinary people, I'm saying how has it emerged in public discourses? What are the different sides at which has emerged? And what are the political consequences of this? And for me, in one instance would be the most significant political consequence is the identification of, say, in some instance of the Hindu upper caste person as the ordinary person. That this person has historically been marginalized by the state in favor of Dalits, for example, or favor of Muslims, for example. That's one example in terms of thinking about caste. In another political strategy, it would be in terms of class. Now, I want to say also that, and this is links to some of the questions, issues raised by Kriti, for example, and others, and by Shobi, that, I mean, I think there are multiple frameworks of that, but I wouldn't use one particular framework, and I would use, I think it's just as important to look at what well-off people do as what poor people do, since the two exist in interaction with each other. I would argue that I use the term middle class in a very specific manner, and that is because I think middle class, for me, is not an economic term. It is always a moral claim in India. I worked in slums and I worked in gated communities. If you ask anyone, what is your identity? They'll say, I'm a middle class person. So I remember working in a slum and I was a young man, he was saying, he said we didn't have television in those days because we were middle class people. So the reason why it's more that it's not so much that different RWAs, of course they represent different class interests and they're not similar, but in Delhi, for example, there used to be something called a Bhagidari Movement that the Srila Dikshit government had established, where so all RWAs that were registered could meet once a year, and throughout the year they had direct access to various water boards and police, etc., which created a sense of a unified middle classness, which actually did not exist, which played on the idea that middle class is not an economic category at all. Only for marketers is it's an economic category. It's always a moral claim. I have never come across anyone in India that I've spoken to and I've asked them about the class who said, I'm an upper class person. Everyone said they're a middle class person. So again, my interest is really in this sense of, if I'm looking at the very rich, I'm looking at the very poor. What does it mean? What is at stake in being called a middle class person? And why do these ideas circulate? And finally, just to go back to what Kriti's question, I think that, and Kriti's and Mukalika, I think what has happened and why I use these terms is the other thing that I think many of us are interested in, is that the idea of the ordinary, both in quotation marks and how it's used in everyday life, it is used very, very commonly, like modern and like progress, which has become like Hindi terms, or Indian language terms, is also linked to a rise of an anti-politics movement, which others who work in politics have done much more work than I have. but as an anthropologist, I mean, I'm also interested in the kind of ordinary that is discussed for political scientists in order precisely to think about its other lives in the present arena, at the present time, where it has been appropriated by different groups to also talk about the ordinary, that we are also ordinary people. And what are the political consequences of this? How does it work out in electoral strategies? What does it mean in terms of everyone saying, I'm a ordinary middle class person? You know, so even a slum person living in slums thinks that she or he is a middle class person. And how does this link to broader harnessing of electoral strategies towards certain realms? So, I mean, I agree that in such a brief presentation, it's kind of a bit, I mean, it does become a bit of a hodgepodge, but these are some of the ideas I've been interested in, primarily through working my way through what I work on urban issues. So, I mean, yeah.
Thanks, Sanjay. I think we might, if you'll bear with us, we've got about 10 minutes left in the advertised time for this. So I think we might take one or two more questions. And I know Vanita has a question, which I think return us to where you started, which was the contrast between Shaheen Bagh and DLF City. So Vanita, would you like to ask that?
Yes, thank you, Louise. Thank you, Sanjay. My question kind of comes back to your choice to contrast for Shaheen movement, if you want to call it a movement. And I wonder about this choice, because I mean, while both were performed publicly, in many ways, like the similarity ends there. So what brings people to the street, what is at stake, what is protest or considered reclaiming of space and voice, and very importantly, who is appealed to in both the movements is fundamentally different. And so my sense is that the residents of DLF appeal more to the DLF corporation to have their kind of grievances or to put forward their points. Whereas in Shaheen Bagh, you've seen the presence of political representatives and political parties throughout the movement, and it's been continuous, their presence over there. And so I wonder if then the question is more about the redefinition of the state, and in turn, and its role, and then in turn the practice of citizenship, rather than the redefinition of who constitutes the ordinary citizen.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vanita.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's our last question. So
okay.
Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, again, this is a really, it's a really useful question for me to think about. I think what's happening as a first response is that there are, notwithstanding the different kinds of people occupy public spaces, I think there's also a process of redefining what the good street is, which is to say, what is the good public sphere? Is the good public sphere that where certain kinds of protests against the nation take place, like Shaheen Bagh, or is the good public sphere where another version of national identity is being constructed, which is in DLF? This is why I wanted to use the two as to think about as a background to thinking about the broader idea of what is increasingly considered in many of our cities, the good public sphere versus the bad public sphere, the good citizen versus the bad citizen. And this is why capital comes here, private capital, the increasingly significant role being played by private capital in the construction of our cities, Indian cities, is particularly important because it relies on the notion of a certain kind of citizen, a certain kind of consumer citizen who will do certain kinds of things, and not do certain kinds of things, right? So my, the discussion was also trying to think about the emergence of these ideas, but always in mind that in the middle, I'm trying to think about what is the role of private capital now? Okay? What is it doing? How is it influencing ideas of what is a good street, what is a good public sphere? And whether the state is changing or ideas of citizen, I think both are changing dramatically. I mean, in very, very literal terms, in the bureaucracy, which is not in praise of bureaucrats in any way, there are increasingly people who are from the private sector who can now come in, for example, at the joint secretary level, director level, etc. I think both are changing dramatically. The state is changing, and the state's idea of the citizens who need to be listened to that is changing. Just as what is changing is an idea, a broader idea of who is actually the so-called ordinary citizen. I mean, I'm willing to think about this. I think both are dramatically changing. I mean, I think the state is dramatically changing. I mean, if you actually speak to bureaucrats and the manner in which policies are formulated, and the manner in which the idea of the nation as a sphere of policy is produced, and the manner in which decisions are taken, the relationship with global states, relationship with global private capital, there's a dramatic change, I would argue, on both the fronts.
Thank you ever so much, Sanjay. There are still some questions coming in, but I think I'm going to draw a line for now and encourage you before you log off to make sure you check the chat, because you might want to respond or just pick up some of those questions. But I think the discussion has really demonstrated that you've opened up a very fertile and important territory for us to think about when we're trying to get to grips with the contemporary phenomenon of state society capital relations in India as they are in clear and rapid flux. So thank you very much for posing these questions to us, and also such an eloquent exposition of the two field sites that you've talked about. And thank you also to everyone else for attending. It's been wonderful to see many old friends and new friends join us. Just so that you're all aware, the next of these seminars will happen on the 29th of October, when we have Filippo Boni talking about Sino-Pakistani relations. That will be the same time. And then we have a very exciting series of seminars, which our new lecturer in India and Global Affairs, Srilata Sirka, who I think is on the call somewhere, is planning around the theme Confronting Caste. So those will be a series of thematic panel discussions, probably at a slightly later time in the afternoon on Thursdays, but we will have more information about that series before too long. And I hope many of you will join us again for those upcoming events. So thank you again, Sanjay, and thank you all of you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you.
And look forward to seeing you again.
Yeah. Thank you for the great questions. Thank you. Thank you.